Reading with your kids.
Hey, so great to see you. Come on in. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. Our mission is to help families grow closer together by reading more. We are so happy that you're part of our beautiful Reading with Your Kids family, part of that mission. We want to thank you, and we encourage you to let people know where they can find the podcast. And you can find the podcast at the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Podbean, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Lincoln Peirce. He is here to celebrate his brand new graphic novel. It's in the Max in the Midnight series. The name of the new book, Battle of the Bodkins. Hey, before our guest comes in, we gave a sneak preview of the Solve It for Kids podcast here on Reading with Your Kids, and it was so popular, it's like spun off. It spun off into its own thing. And my buddy, our dean of all things STEM and STEAM, Jennifer Swanson, is here to tell us a little bit about what's going on with this great new podcast. Hey, Jennifer, what's up?
Hi, Jed. Oh, I am so excited about our new podcast. We've been getting some great reviews. Everybody wants to find out what's going on and meet and listen to some of our scientists and engineers. We have done how do you map an underwater forest?
Yeah.
We have done how do you cut a person in half safely, of course.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
We have talked about improving your connection with water by going on a water walk, and we have watched Vanessa Brantley Newton create illustrations that come to life.
I took a water walk with my amazing niece. We had such a great time. I didn't fall into the water, but it was really, really fun. And I love the fact that all of our guests are giving our wonderful listeners challenges, really fun challenges that they can do together as a family. And that's so cool. Hey, tell everybody where they can find Solve It for Kids, because it's not on the Reading with Your Kids podcast. It's its own thing.
So please, if you want to keep listening, go over to iTunes and Apple Podcasts and subscribe. And you can download all 4 of the first episodes that we have, plus listen to all the new ones we have coming out. You can also find on Stitcher Radio and, of course, through our website, solveitforkids.com.
Jennifer, thanks so much. Thanks for letting me be part of this awesome podcast.
Well, we make a great STEM team, don't you think?
Absolutely. All right, join us over at solveitforkids.com. Joining us right now from the beautiful state of Maine, he is returning to the show to celebrate the latest chapter in the Max in the Midnight series. It's called Battle of the Bodkins. Please welcome back to the show, Lincoln Peirce. Lincoln, how are you?
I'm good, Jen. How are you doing?
Doing fantastic. It's a bright, sunny day here in beautiful Reedville in Boston. And I'm really excited. It's always great to speak to you and to speak to you not only about the stories, but also to speak to you about how wonderful it is that we have graphic novels that kids can really get excited about.
I think about this a lot because, I often say that I try to write the sort of books that I would have liked to read when I was a kid, and there were not books like mine or like, Raina Telgemeyer's or, so many of the other authors who are doing either graphic novels or hybrid novels, which is sort of what I call mine. It's kind of a cross between an illustrated novel and a graphic novel, but there just weren't these sorts of books for kids when I was coming up, and so I agree. It always just makes me happy, makes me excited if I'm in a bookstore, if I'm in a library, and I see books that really celebrate, the language of comics, which is something I've been interested in my whole life, and it's such a great vehicle for storytelling. And so I envy the kids of today. There is a lot of great stuff for them to choose from.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've said this on the show a lot, and I just want to continue saying it again, just to to remind people who've heard it before and to let people who haven't heard it before know that reading graphic novels, reading comics is reading. And it's something to be celebrated. If our kids are excited about graphic novels, don't make the mistake that I made and kind of poo-poo it and say, please read a book without pictures. Celebrate the fact your kids are reading, and they're reading some really great stories.
Yeah, it is so true. And, I know a lot of schools are actually really, they're not only encouraging their kids to read graphic novels, but they also are using comics as teaching tools. They are, because when you think about it, a little comic strip, like if you take a 4-panel comic strip, like a classic Peanuts comic strip, it's such a great little exercise in storytelling. I mean, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The whole idea of a sequential narrative is really fundamental to storytelling. And when kids are really first learning how to put stories together, comics are a great way for them to start thinking about, how to put a story out there. And, they're thinking not just from a narrative standpoint, but also from a visual standpoint. So I think it stimulates their brains in a way that reading a book that has no visual aspect to it, it's one isn't better than the other, but it's just a different way for kids to engage in stories, and I think it's great.
Yeah, and we've talked, and people know that kids have different talents and abilities and strengths and weaknesses, and if your kid is one of those kids who can grasp things much better with that visual aid, then just why not celebrate it? We have no problem putting training wheels on bikes for kids, or adjusting the seat when you're driving. It's I just whatever can get kids interested in reading and learning and stories, I think is something to be celebrated.
Absolutely. I think we know now, and probably in ways that we didn't know years ago, that, one template isn't going to work for all kids. Kids learn really differently. I'm sure we all know a kid who, if you put a sheet of math homework in front of that kid, it's just not going to resonate with them. They might get frustrated. They might get confused. But that same kid, you give them, a complex set of Legos and they build the most amazing thing, or, they can intuitively kind of figure out a way that something that has been taken apart needs to get put back together. And so that I started hearing right away when I started writing books like this was the phrase reluctant readers, mm-hmm. and the way that young people, especially boys, were responding to books like mine, or like Jeff Kinney's Wimpy Kid books, or Dave Pilkey's books, or Raina's books. These were great sort of, gateway experiences with stories for kids who maybe to that point hadn't really been that turned on by reading. So you're right. It's to be celebrated.
So let's celebrate Max in the Midnights. Remind us who Max is.
So when we meet Max at the beginning of the first book, Max is a 10-year-old apprentice troubadour in this sort of fictional medieval world. And we learn subsequently in that book, I kept it secret for the first 50 pages, but you learn that Max is a girl. You start the story thinking that Max is a boy. Mm-hmm. And so Max has no interest in being a troubadour. Max wants to be a knight, and she learns, in fact, that, well, in this medieval world, girls really can't be knights. That's just not something that is a reality. And so that first story sort of traces, her progression from this disgruntled apprentice troubadour into somebody who, she meets some friends, some sort of partners for this adventure that she has, and they become the Midnights. And that first story traces that journey from, troubadour to aspiring knight. And then the new book, Battle of the Bodkins, just picks up where the first book left off with more adventures and sort of more ruminations on the whole idea of identity, because in the first book, Max's identity as a girl is sort of central to what's happening. And in the second book, everyone's identity is sort of up in the air because of these creatures called Bodkins. And Bodkins are essentially shape-shifting creatures that can look exactly like, your brother or your best friend or the king of Bijovia in the case of this book. And so Max has to sort of unravel all of that with the help of the other Midnights. And so there's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of slapstick, there's a lot of humor, and that's sort of the elevator pitch version of book 2, Battle of the Bodkins.
Interesting. Where did the idea for the shape-shifting Bodkins come from? What was the inspiration there?
Well, the inspiration came from this expression, odd Bodkins, where, I do not claim to be a medieval historian, but, there are expressions that sort of come down through history that, have their sort of genesis in an earlier time. And there was this phrase, odd Bodkins, which I had read over and over again, just as a means of expression. Like, instead of saying holy cow, in the Middle Ages, someone might have said odd Bodkins or odds Bodkins. And so I thought, well, what even is a bodkin? And I thought, well, I didn't even look it up. I just thought, I'm going to decide what a bodkin is just for storytelling purposes. And so it was really just this word, this mystery word, and this mysterious expression that sort of sparked this idea in me that, well, someone subsequently told me that a bodkin is another word for a knife that was sometimes used during medieval times, but I didn't know that and wouldn't have used that information in the story anyway. I just decided, I was going to create what a bodkin was, and I thought it would be interesting if, there were, these kind of mysterious figures walking among us who were literally almost entirely, our ability to sort of discern who they were, that they weren't really who we thought they were, was compromised. And I thought that would be fun, and it was. I really enjoyed putting the story together and creating this sort of alternate universe, this world, this shadow world, which ends up being called Knot, Knot, and that's the world where the Bodkins are. And I really enjoyed it. It sort of has a lot of twists and turns, and that's always fun in a story.
I'm curious. I love that you decided that the Bodkins are going to be this, and I think that's something. I think that's one of the wonderful things about encouraging our kids to write and create, is that you're giving them the power to make these decisions. As you're creating these fantasy worlds, and you're creating the laws, the physics that exist in those worlds, do you kind of sit down at the beginning of the creation process and kind of map those things out, or are you putting the physics together as you're going along, and you're halfway through the story and something happens and you decide, okay, well, it's going to work this way?
Yeah, it's definitely door number 2. It's making it up as I go along. I've never been good at mapping out a story because, and I think this might come sort of from my comic strip background, because I've done a daily comic strip for many years called Big Nate, and a daily comic strip it's a lot of obviously little stories that if you want to have a storyline that lasts a week or 2 weeks, you sort of knit them together, and you just sort of, you may think the story's going to go one way on a Wednesday, but then you think of a funny joke that you can do for Thursday, and that might take the story in a different direction. And I like that. And so I write my novels one chapter at a time, and I send them into my editor one chapter at a time. And I tell her, and I think she's sort of secretly horrified by this, but I tell her, if I'm halfway through, and she might say, well, where's it going, or how's it going to end? And I'll say, I don't know. I'm not sure yet. But I like working that way because there are plenty of times when I'm working where I'll write something in chapter 9 that I had no idea was going to happen when I was working on chapter 8. And that to me is a fun way to work. It's exciting, and I'm lucky because so far anyway, knock wood, it hasn't resulted in my realizing, when I'm 2/3 of the way through the book, oh, this won't work. I'm going to have to go back and start all over again. So far I've been able to sort of, make it work as I go along.
I love that. I know for myself, being up on stage and when we're able to be up on stage and in person performing for folks, having somebody from the audience up on stage with me is so much fun because I have no idea what's going to happen. And there are very often times I've told a story before of my daughter when she was in 3rd grade, up on stage with me doing something that we had done hundreds of times before, and this one particular college kid came up on stage with us, and it went in an entirely different, wonderful, amazing direction. And those are like really magical moments, and I'm really happy you get to experience that as you're writing.
Yeah, that is fascinating. You're talking about something I have always admired in others, in performers, is that ability to be improvisational. And, I admire it in actors or in comedians. I admire it in musicians. I'm not a musician, but one of the things that I am most amazed by is musicians who know their instruments so well and are so musically adept that, they can just riff on something, on a piece that they've played many times, and then they can just take it in an entirely different direction in a way that seems effortless. I know it's not effortless, but I admire that, and so it's something I kind of aspire to in my own way when I write.
You are very different than a lot of writers in that you're constantly creating. There are some folks I know who work on a story for a year or two, or I've heard people who've written, worked on stories for more than 3 or 4 years. As somebody who's putting out a daily comic strip, that takes that creative muscle. How did you get that creative muscle of yours to the point where you're able to come up with something so consistently?
I think it comes from growing up immersed in it. I think, a musician, if a kid grows up in a musical household, that's just the way that muscle is developed. You play music with your parents, or you sing with your family, or whatever, and it doesn't seem that extraordinary to you. And in my case, it wasn't that my family was a comics family. I mean, I don't think my parents ever really even read the comics, but I was a comicsy kid, and I was always reading comics, especially newspaper comics. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that's how my brain got wired as I grew up, that I was always thinking in terms of, I mentioned Peanuts before, and mm-hmm. Peanuts was my favorite comic strip, as it was for many people my age. And Peanuts, for most of its 50-year run, Peanuts was a 4-panel comic strip. And so I think I just started thinking in 4 panels. I mean, that was a rhythm that became hardwired into me. And so it's still the way I think when I'm writing, when I'm thinking of comic strip ideas. I'm thinking of those 4 panels, and oftentimes I think of it backwards. I'll think of the punchline first, so I get panel 4 set in my mind, and then I just figure out what has to happen in panels 1 through 3 to get me to panel 4.
As you're talking about, especially talking about these 4-panel comic strips, it made me think of the reality of today, where so many kids are creating and telling stories through Instagram posts or through through these images that they're creating and they're putting out there. I don't think a lot of kids are intentional about the stories that they're putting out there, but I really hope they become intentional about it, because I think that's good advice. What would you? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you had advice for a young person out there, or even an older person out there that's on Instagram and wants to communicate, how would you advise them to go in terms of how they would approach creating a new story that they'll be sharing on social media?
Well, I know very little about Instagram, but I am not active in social media myself, but what I know of it is that it's a platform that is incredible. To me, it just seems incredibly exciting and freeing. We have, there's a family that we know here in Portland, and our kids grew up together, and their 2 daughters were about the same age as our 2 kids, and their 2 daughters are active on Instagram, and they both were aspiring actors as they were growing up, and I'm still very involved in that. And Instagram for them is a way to sort of almost create these little plays, these little stage shows, little skits. And I've watched a couple of, one of them has done a couple of things that I've seen, and which I just find incredibly funny, and they only last, 10, 15 seconds. Mm-hmm. But they're phenomenal. And I think those are the sorts of things that, it doesn't matter if they go viral. It doesn't matter how many people follow it or what have you. But just to know that you're putting something out there, that you're doing something creative, I think it just is such an amazing opportunity for young people now to maybe say, not necessarily to say like, this is who I am, but in a lot of cases it's more about, this is what I like. This is something that I think is funny. This is something that I think is sad. There's those sorts of opportunities for kind of self-expression that, in an earlier time, kids might have been asked to, write an essay about such and such. Mm-hmm. And, not all kids are great at writing essays, but, a kid that's not great at writing an essay might be phenomenal at making a little, Instagram story about it,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Can you think back to when you were young and I don't know, what would you have done if you had access to this kind of technology?
I think I would have been in the way that I read about filmmakers, like I read about, it's like Steven Spielberg making these elaborate, like movies when he was, 10, 11, 12 years old. And I think, for those of us who grew up in a generation where, TV was, there was no internet, there was no YouTube, and so telling if this technology had invented back then, and there was a way just to like, wow, tell these stories, literally on my phone, just make a little movie. I think that's what I would have been doing. I would have been, getting together with my friends and saying, like, let's make a gangster movie. Let's make a horror movie. Let's tell stories, because to me, I like telling stories, and I don't think in my case the stories I'm not all that interested in telling stories about myself. I'm interested in telling stories about things that I think up. and that are either imaginary or reflect a life that is more interesting than my own life is. You know, my life is not nearly as interesting. I love my life, but it's not nearly as eventful or interesting as the lives of the characters I write about. That's what's fun about writing, is you can make things up that are exciting and that you never could really experience yourself.
I'm wondering, Lincoln, as we're talking here and talking about stories and talking about characters that you're creating in your mind, is there a story or a character that you haven't been able to tell yet because it doesn't fit into Big Nate or Max and the Midnights, and you just haven't found the platform to kind of share the story yet?
I'm not sure. I mean, I have these sort of vague ideas that, you know, boy, it might be fun one day to do a graphic novel that is not necessarily aimed at a young audience. You know, because I've only ever written books for readers aged, say, 7 to 12 or 8 to 12. I mean, that's my sort of sweet spot when I write. But that's a little different from the comic strip. The comic strip I write essentially for anyone who likes comics, and you don't have to be a 12-year-old kid to like comic strips and read them. And so I think, well, I could write a story that was for all ages, a novel that was for all ages. It could still be funny, and who knows, maybe it would still even have kid characters, but it might not be so sort of specifically for a certain age group. So I have ideas like that kicking around, but I'm not sure. I don't think as of right now that there's one character that's sort of lurking in my mind that I'm thinking I just have to find the right way to bring this character out. But that could happen. We'll see.
Yeah. We need to know where folks can find out more about you, find out more about Big Nate, and of course find out more about Battle of the Bodkins.
So as I said, I am not a social media person, so I can't point people toward a Twitter account or something like that, but I can tell them that there's an enormous archive of Big Nate comics that they can read on gocomics.com, and you can find Big Nate there, and you can find a ton of other comics there. And Battle of the Bodkins, it's one thing that's fun about, when a book gets put on Amazon or something like that is you can read a little sneak peek. It says look inside. There's a little icon that says look inside. So you go on Amazon and you find Battle of the Bodkins on Amazon and click on look inside, and you can get a little sneak peek. If you have no idea what a Max and the Midnight book is like, you can get a little sneak peek looking at it that way. So those are the ways that folks can sort of like get a little view as to the things that I do in my office when I'm sitting at my desk or when I'm drawing. Those are the things that I'm doing.
That's wonderful. What a great thing to do in an office. I think we all wish we had an opportunity to sit and play and have fun in our offices every day.
Yeah, I am very lucky. I work at home. I've got a little office that's just off our dining room, and it's a total mess. But I don't mind. I'm a person who I don't mind a little clutter, and I think in some cases it even sort of sparks my creativity at times. Mm-hmm. So I'm super lucky in that way that I'm not. I've had jobs where I've gotten up in the morning and gone off to a job and worked conventional hours wearing a tie and then come home, and I prefer the sort of job I have now. So I'm really lucky.
Awesome. We've had a great time speaking to the author and illustrator of the great new graphic novel in the Max and the Midnight series. It's called Battle of the Bodkins, and our guest has been Lincoln Peirce. Hey, Lincoln, thanks so much for being back with us.
It's such a pleasure, Jed. Great talking to you. Thank you.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Pam Allen, Vice President of Scholastic Publishing. She'll be here to get us ready for World Read-Aloud Day. World Read-Aloud Day is happening on February 3rd. We want to get you ready for it. It's a wonderful celebration. We hope you and your family will take part in it, and we hope that you join us for Pam's visit. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Lincoln Peirce. Be sure to check out Max and the Midnight, the latest book, Battle of the Bodkins, and also check out Big Nate. I want to thank my team, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. I want to thank Augie the doggy for having my back here in the studio. But most of all, I want to thank you. You are the reason we are here. And you are making the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.